Hey Lighthouse, my name is Josh Yang, and I'm the youth deacon here at ACC. Dom and I are really excited that we're going through this series. We believe this is one of the most unique and important times in our society to understand how our faith, our culture, and our politics intersect. So we picked a handful of topics that we feel are particularly relevant, and I hope this is an engaging way for us to think critically about how to apply faith to real life issues. Today, we're going to be talking about why caring for the immigrant and refugee matters for us as Christians. As a church made up of mainly second-generation Asian Americans, most of us have directly benefited from our country's current immigration system. Personally, my parents were both born in Taiwan and moved to Louisiana for grad school. They both initially became permanent residents, and after a while, they both received their citizenship. Meanwhile, my brother and I were both born in the US, so we were automatically citizens, and we were able to benefit from all the privileges that came with that citizenship. My parents, however, had to really fight for those privileges. They were one of the fortunate ones in the sense that they had to apply to immigrate, get selected to be allowed to come over, had the means to do so, then were also fortunate enough to stay by securing employment after their degrees were completed. I imagine most of us have a similar story. Maybe you were born in the US, but your parents were born overseas. Or maybe you yourselves moved from overseas at a young age. Chances are, though, if you're a member at ACC, you've been directly impacted and have benefited from the current US immigration policy. And whenever we've benefited from a system, it's hard to look objectively at that system and see its flaws. It's hard to want to change something that we benefited from. And it's hard to be compassionate for those that have circumvented the rules that helped us get to where we are today. Nevertheless, I don't think it's a controversial statement to say our immigration system is broken. It's one of the rare issues that politicians on both sides of the spectrum agree with. What they don't agree on is necessarily how to fix it. There's a general consensus that illegal immigration needs to be limited and that our current legal avenues are overwhelmed. But what defines illegal immigration, what to do about it, and how to fix the system generates some fierce debate. Today, we'll look at some biblical principles that surround immigration and how they play out in public policy. We won't be recommending any specific solutions, but instead, we'll look at pros and cons surrounding several policies, as well as discuss in our small groups how we as a church community and as individual Christ followers can respond. First, let's define a few terms to make sure we're all talking about the same thing. We'll look at two different categories of people who might leave their homeland and the different reasons that compel them to do so. To simplify things for our discussion today, we'll use a couple broad terms to refer to two different groups of people: immigrants and refugees. This isn't nearly as nuanced as our legal system is, but it will at least get us on the same page to start the conversation. We'll define immigrants as people who leave their home country in search of a better life for themselves or their family, typically but not always being economically motivated. We'll define refugees as people who leave their home country due to political or religious persecution, typically motivated simply by survival. There's definitely some overlap between these definitions, particularly when economic desperation can force someone to leave, but we'll stick with these two categories for now. Next, we should also define what the role of government is when it comes to immigration and how that's different from the role of the church, or how it might be different from our priorities as individuals. Governments have an obligation to maintain order and enforce justice for all its citizens and to protect them from any potential harm for both inside and outside their borders. When it comes to immigration, the government's priority is to seek the well-being of its citizens and the welfare of the nation first. It may sound callous, but to a degree it is. But in this case, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. The needs and well-being of any potential immigrants come second to the needs of its own citizens. We as individuals, however, aren't limited solely to acting through policy. We can act at a human or moral level as well as a political level, and we're responsible to do both. Our individual actions don't have to bear the weight and responsibility of macro-societal or economic trends, but our votes that help determine policy do. The government cares for society as a whole through policy, but the church can care at the individual level with our actions, while also helping shape society as a whole through our political voice. We'll also divide this lesson into two main sections: the moral aspects based on biblical principles, and the legal aspect that shapes public policy. The moral aspect deals more with how immigrants should be viewed and treated, and this is primarily our individual actions. The legal aspect answers what immigration law should look like. This is our political action as well as government policy. The former is more straightforward for us as Christians, and the latter gets complicated fast when we discuss tangible policies. For the moral aspect, the Bible is explicit in how immigrants should be viewed and what responsibility the church holds when it comes to caring for them. As Dominic mentioned in his lesson a couple of weeks ago on the concept of Imago Dei, humanity is created in the image and likeness of God and therefore inherently imbued with worth. Last week in his lesson on race relations, Dominic mentioned that regardless of our political views, we should ask ourselves how God would feel about some of the current events involving police and people of color. Both of these principles still apply. When it comes specifically to dealing with immigrants, God commands his people to remember their own immigrant experience in Egypt, as well as their status as refugees wandering in the wilderness. In Exodus 22:21, when Moses is delivering the law, God commands, "You should not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt." He repeats this same command in Exodus 23:9 a few verses later, almost word for word. Later in Deuteronomy, after the golden calf and the second set of tablets, God reminds the people of his character and what that means for them. He says, "For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, and the awesome God, who is not partial and takes no bribe. He executes justice for the fatherless and the widow and loves the sojourner, giving him food and clothing. Love the sojourner, therefore, for you are sojourners in the land of Egypt." A few chapters later, when discussing tithes and offerings, God commands the people to give the first fruits of their labor as an offering, and then the Levite would share that offering with the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, so that they may eat within your towns and be filled. Clearly, God cares a great deal for the immigrant and calls for his people to do the same. Any type of policy on immigration or political asylum doesn't change the biblical principle that all people should be treated humanely and that Christians are called to care for the less fortunate and the vulnerable. However, a principle of loving our neighbors doesn't automatically translate to any particular or singular policy when it comes to immigration. The Bible doesn't advise on public policy or give any specifics on legislation. The moral principles we've been talking about can translate directly into policy in an ideal world, but because of the sin and brokenness of our current world, public policy usually has to reflect those compromises. From a legal perspective, we can ask both what immigration law should look like in an ideal state as well as what's feasible now. It's also important to make the distinction that even though there are a lot of things wrong with our current system, individual issues can be addressed without abandoning the system as a whole. Also, it's important to note that a broken or flawed implementation of any given policy doesn't necessarily negate the effectiveness or necessity of the policy itself. For example, immigration court is a flawed part of our system. It's under the Department of Justice, which falls under the executive branch rather than the judiciary branch, so it's technically not required to provide lawyers to defendants who can't afford them. The solution isn't to allow everyone to stay or to get rid of the courts, but there are tangible steps we can provide, like providing lawyers to those who can't afford them, and increasing staffing to have an adequate number of judges to hear cases in order to examine them carefully and equally. Regardless of your political leaning, I think these are human and moral benefits that everyone can agree on. Another example is the U.S.'s policy on refugees and asylum seekers. There are two main components to seeking asylum. First, applicants are required to establish that they fear persecution in their home country. Second, they need to prove that they would be persecuted based on at least one of 5 protected grounds, which are race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or particular social group. When it comes to our current system, there isn't too much debate on the requirements for taking in refugees. Instead, people are typically split on the number of refugees our country allows in any given year and how to ensure those who are let in are safe. There are definitely still some issues with the current system, though that would need to be addressed. Things like particularly long waiting times while refugees remain in dangerous situations, or seemingly arbitrary decision processes based on a person's nationality rather than the facts of their particular case. And also the fact that the US has taken in less refugees per capita compared to other developed nations. Again, I believe these are largely moral concerns that Christians should support in alignment with God's heart for the needy. Other policies, though, are a bit more complicated. We won't go into whether these are right or wrong. Instead, let's look at the pros and cons of each and try to tie in the principles we discussed earlier. A common proposal whenever immigration is brought up is to simply have open borders, meaning the US allows a free flow of people in and out of the country. It's been argued that open borders help give people in poorer countries more opportunities and can boost an overall world economy if other countries also participate. It also removes a legal system of privilege based solely on luck and birthright, like how my brother and I both got access to all the privileges of citizenship while my parents had to apply and work and wait for it. The arguments against open borders is that it can create a vacuum of more talented and educated professionals to boost the source of country's local economy, and that can also lower wages for the average worker in the host country by replacing unskilled workers domestically. Open borders might also require a larger scope of governing at the world level that's currently unrealistic. Another big piece of immigration legislation is DACA, or the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals Act. This allows people who entered the country illegally as children to receive a renewable 2-year period of deferred action from deportation and become eligible for a work permit but not for citizenship. DACA was announced by executive action in 2012. It was rescinded in 2017, but through a series of court cases, it was upheld in 2020. And there are still some active court cases now to determine what's next. Proponents of DACA argue that it increases the wage and labor force participation of eligible immigrants. It also allows people who've been highly assimilated into American culture to stay in the country rather than return to a land that's pretty much foreign to them. For example, most of us, even though we're Chinese by heritage, probably wouldn't fare too well if we had to go back to Asia right now. People who oppose DACA argue that it wasn't fully lawful according to current immigration law and that the executive action goes against the constitutional powers assigned to Congress. When enforced as written, DACA might also require splitting up families if the parents of DACA-eligible immigrants aren't allowed to stay. So this has resulted in several attempts to expand the scope of DACA to include parents or other guardians, which has been used as a reason for why it never should have been enacted in the first place. Lastly, another common suggestion whenever illegal immigration is mentioned is to simply provide a path for naturalization for any current illegal immigrant in the country. Most notably, this was a key part of a highly publicized bipartisan proposal back in 2013 and has come up several times since. The pros of this is that it would allow current illegal immigrants to register, to come out of hiding, and to be eligible for more services such as healthcare and higher education. It would also require them to pay a fine as well as any back taxes owed for previous income. The cons is that it could encourage further illegal immigration in hopes of a similar future amnesty, and that it would be unfair to those currently waiting for visas or other legal means of entering the country. Hopefully, as you can tell, these are complicated policies with nuanced consequences, and there aren't really any easy solutions. We have some biblical principles in terms of how God calls us to care for the vulnerable and the least of these among us, but no clear-cut answers on what that means. It doesn't always translate cleanly to a policy, but I hope we can continue to wrestle with how we can examine a flawed system, even if it's one we benefit from, and how we can continue to model God's heart for the immigrant and the refugee in our politics. So here are some discussion questions for your small group, and stay tuned for some announcements. Thanks.
First is our weekly Wednesday Hangouts, which start every Wednesday night at 7 p.m. If you would like to join, you can go to acc.church/Wednesday Hangouts. If you have any feedback you'd like to give, please go to acc.church/Hangouts-feedback. We really appreciate it. Our second announcement is that there isn't going to be Lighthouse on Friday, October 9th because of the missions conference. We highly encourage you to attend the missions conference, and if you would like more information, you can go to the ACC English website.
As some of you may already know, ACC is planning on using Cedar Creek Elementary as an additional worship site for Sunday services, and this will be starting sometime next year. So for now, ACC is asking us to fill out this survey, just asking 2 simple questions, one of which is if we're able to participate, if we can go to this other site. And the second question is just to see how much we are planning on supporting this second site.